The discovery was purely accidental. Emma, a curious 8-year-old with a love for exploring, had wandered into the dusty attic of her grandmother's old Victorian house. She'd always felt a strange allure toward the place, with its creaking floors, dim light filtering through small, grimy windows, and towering stacks of old boxes. Her grandmother had warned her to stay out, saying it was filled with things best left alone, but her curiosity got the better of her one rainy afternoon while her grandmother napped. Emma pulled open a dusty trunk, coughing as a plume of dust filled the air. Inside, among faded quilts and old photographs, lay a doll. It was small and delicate, dressed in a faded lace dress, with porcelain skin and eyes that seemed too large for its face. The eyes were a deep, inky blue, almost black, and appeared strangely lifelike. Though covered in grime, the doll seemed to stare directly at her, its painted smile frozen yet unsettlingly sharp. The tag on its dress read, "Isabel," scrawled in a child's handwriting. There was something about the doll that both fascinated and repelled her. But before she could think twice, Emma picked it up, cradling it in her arms. That night, Emma took Isabel to her room, setting the doll on a shelf beside her bed. As she drifted to sleep, she thought she heard something. Soft whispers, barely audible, as if someone were muttering secrets in the dark. She dismissed it as her imagination, but a strange dream followed. In it, she was wandering through the attic again, only this time it was filled with shadows that moved, soft giggles echoing around her. She saw glimpses of children, faces half hidden, looking at her with vacant dark eyes. She woke with a start, glancing over at the shelf, where Isabel sat, her unblinking eyes seemingly fixed on Emma. The next morning, Emma felt groggy, but dismissed the dream as nothing more than a result of her overactive imagination. However, as she left her room, she froze, noticing Isabel was no longer on the shelf. Instead, the doll was propped up on her desk, facing her bed. Frowning, she asked her grandmother if she had moved it, but her grandmother merely gave her a puzzled look. Emma shrugged it off, placing Isabel back on the shelf and telling herself it must have been her sleepwalking. But that night, Isabel moved again, this time to the chair by the window, sitting primly, hands in her lap, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. Days passed, and Isabel's movements became more frequent. No matter where Emma left her, the doll would appear somewhere else in the room, sometimes closer to her bed, other times perched on the dresser, its dark, watchful eyes always on Emma. Each night she would hear faint whispers, barely audible, but each night they grew clearer, filled with strange, half-formed words that sent chills down her spine. One evening as she lay in bed, she decided to listen closely, straining her ears to decipher the soft, lilting words. "Find me," the voice whispered, drifting through the silence like a breeze. "Remember, don't forget." The words were barely above a whisper, but they were unmistakable, as though they were being spoken directly into her ear. Emma pulled the covers up to her chin, heart pounding, the weight of those words settling into her mind. She felt an inexplicable urge to listen, to uncover the secrets the doll seemed to hold, despite the fear twisting in her stomach. The following day, her grandmother noticed Emma's pale face and asked if everything was all right. Hesitating, Emma mentioned Isabel's strange movements and the whispers at night. Her grandmother's face darkened, a shadow of fear flickering across her eyes. She pulled Emma close, her voice a stern whisper. "That doll belonged to my sister Lydia," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "When I was young, we were inseparable until Lydia died." Her voice trailed off, and she swallowed, her hands trembling slightly as she stroked Emma's hair. "After she passed, I found that doll everywhere, on my bed, in my room, whispering things I couldn't understand. My mother locked it in the attic, told me to leave it there. Isabel, she holds something of Lydia in her, and some things are best left forgotten." Emma's heart pounded as she listened, but curiosity outweighed her fear. That night, as the house fell silent, she took Isabel in her hands, looking into the doll's deep, unsettling eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered, barely daring to breathe. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a faint, childlike giggle echoed around her, and the whispers returned, louder this time, filling the room like an invisible presence. "Find me, in the attic." Her blood ran cold. The voice was soft, yet insistent, urging her, drawing her back to the place where she'd first found the doll. Against her better judgment, Emma crept out of bed, clutching Isabel tightly, and tiptoed up the stairs to the attic. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, but she pressed on, feeling the doll grow colder in her hands with every step. When she reached the attic, the whispers grew louder, echoing off the walls, filling her ears. Isabel's head seemed to turn slightly in her hands, her dark eyes fixing on an old chest in the corner. Compelled, Emma walked over, opening the lid slowly. Inside were faded photos of her grandmother and her sister Lydia, smiling, their faces lit with childhood innocence. There was also a small, dusty book, its pages filled with drawings and notes scrawled in a child's hand. The last entry sent a shiver down Emma's spine. "I have a secret, Isabel told me. She'll never leave me." As Emma flipped through the book, the whispers grew frantic, almost pleading. "Find me," they urged. Her hands trembled as she reached the final page, where a small lock of hair had been carefully tucked between the pages. The hair was tied with a faded blue ribbon, matching the one on Isabel's dress. The air grew colder, the whispers turned to sobs, and Emma felt a weight settle over her, as though someone were standing right behind her, breathing against her neck. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder, icy and firm. She gasped, spinning around, but there was no one there. Only the shadows danced in the flickering light from the lone attic bulb, and the whispers faded, replaced by a silence that felt far too heavy. She glanced down at Isabel, who sat in her lap, her painted smile wider than ever, her eyes glittering with something dark and unnatural. Emma's grandmother found her the next morning, asleep on the floor of the attic, Isabel cradled in her arms. Emma couldn't remember how she'd gotten there, and when she looked at the doll, she could swear it looked satisfied. Her grandmother's face was pale, her hands shaking as she took Isabel and returned her to the trunk, locking it tightly and telling Emma not to speak of it again. But the damage was done. The whispers continued, filling Emma's nights with half-remembered secrets and fragments of Lydia's childhood. As the days passed, Emma found herself drawn to the attic again and again, feeling as though part of her were still there, lingering with Isabel. She grew pale and distracted, her mind filled with fragments of memories she couldn't recognize. Running through fields, singing songs she'd never learned, seeing faces she'd never met. Her grandmother noticed the change, her face growing tight with worry, but there was nothing she could do. Isabel had a hold on her now. On the last night Emma stayed in the house, she felt the whispers beckon her one last time. She slipped out of bed, drawn to the attic by an invisible pull. When she opened the trunk, Isabel was waiting, her dark eyes gleaming, her painted smile wide. "We're together now," the whisper said, a childlike voice filled with a twisted joy. "Forever." In the morning, her grandmother found Emma's bed empty, the house eerily silent. When she went to the attic, she found the trunk open, Isabel sitting inside, her dark eyes as empty as ever. But beside the doll lay something new, a small, faded book filled with childish drawings, one that hadn't been there before. And on the last page, scrawled in a familiar hand, were the words, "I have a secret. Isabel told me she'll never leave me." Though she searched for days, Emma was never found. The house was sold years later, and when new tenants moved in, they found an old doll in the attic, her dark eyes seeming to follow them wherever they went. And at night, they would hear soft whispers echoing through the halls, promising secrets from the past to anyone willing to listen closely. The ghostly caretaker nestled deep in the mountains. The old Blackwood Lodge was famous for its isolation and rustic charm. With its towering stone facade and ivy-covered walls, it seemed untouched by time, a relic of an era long past. For years, travelers seeking peace and quiet would brave the winding roads to stay in its creaking rooms and enjoy the sweeping views of mist-covered forests. But the lodge had an unusual reputation. Those who visited spoke of strange occurrences, whispers in empty hallways, and an old caretaker who seemed to appear whenever needed, his presence both comforting and unsettling. Caroline and her fiancé, Mark, decided to spend a weekend at Blackwood Lodge, eager for a getaway. The lodge had been recommended by a friend, who described it as hauntingly beautiful and full of old-world charm. When they arrived, They were immediately struck by its grandeur. The massive, weathered structure loomed before them, casting long shadows in the fading evening light. A chilly wind stirred the air, and Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that the lodge was watching them, waiting. They were greeted by an elderly man in a worn suit and hat, his face pale but friendly, with an intense gaze that seemed to see right through them. His voice was gravelly and soft, carrying a weight of age and wisdom. "Welcome to Blackwood Lodge," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm Arthur, the caretaker. If you need anything, just ring the bell at the front desk. I'm here to help." They thanked him and followed him up the grand staircase, which creaked underfoot. The lodge was filled with old furniture, faded wallpaper, and portraits of long-forgotten guests, their eyes following them as they walked. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust, and the only sound was the echo of their footsteps against the stone floors. Arthur led them to their room, a spacious suite with a large, drafty window overlooking the misty forest. "Enjoy your stay," he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes before slipping out of the room, leaving them alone. That night, as they settled into bed, Caroline found herself unable to sleep. Shadows danced across the walls, shifting with each gust of wind that rattled the window. The room felt cold, unnaturally so, and an inexplicable heaviness pressed down on her, as though the lodge itself were pressing in. Just as she was beginning to drift off, she heard a soft knock at the door. She nudged Mark, but he was already deep asleep, oblivious. Slowly, she got up and opened the door. Standing in the dimly lit hallway was Arthur, his face shrouded in shadows, his expression grave. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice low and almost hollow. Surprised, Caroline nodded, but before she could say anything, Arthur continued, "The lodge has a way of getting under your skin. If you ever feel uncomfortable, just come to my office. I'll be there." He paused, his eyes distant, as if lost in thought. "It can be hard to leave sometimes." With that, he disappeared down the corridor, his footsteps silent on the old floorboards. Caroline closed the door, shivering, an uneasy feeling settling over her. The caretaker's words lingered in her mind, vague and ominous. Hard to leave? She pushed the thought aside, telling herself she was letting the lodge's eerie atmosphere get to her. The next morning, they found the dining room empty, except for a young woman sitting alone at one of the tables. She was staring into her cup of tea, her face pale and eyes red-rimmed, as if she hadn't slept. Curious, Caroline approached her, introducing herself. The woman looked up, her eyes wide and haunted. "Did the caretaker come to your room last night?" she asked, her voice a frightened whisper. Caroline hesitated, then nodded. The woman let out a shaky breath. He came to mine too. Warned me about the lodge, said it was dangerous to be here too long. I thought it was strange, but I didn't think much of it until I looked for him this morning. No one has seen him. The receptionist told me there hasn't been a caretaker here in years. They don't even keep an office for one anymore." A chill ran through Caroline. She returned to her table, exchanging an uneasy glance with Mark as she recounted what the woman had said. Mark laughed, brushing it off as a misunderstanding, but Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Arthur's image haunted her mind, his worn suit, his piercing gaze, his solemn warning. The day passed in a haze. She and Mark explored the grounds, taking in the mist-covered hills and the dense, silent forest. But everywhere she looked, she felt eyes watching her, shadows shifting just out of sight. That night they retired early, hoping for a good night's sleep, but Caroline couldn't settle. The lodge was unnervingly quiet, each creak and groan amplified in the darkness. Just after midnight, she was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside their door, slow and deliberate. She held her breath, waiting. The footsteps stopped just outside, and then came a soft knock. Heart pounding, Caroline opened the door a crack, and there was Arthur, his face half hidden in shadow. His eyes were darker this time, almost empty, his expression grave. "You shouldn't have stayed another night," he whispered, his voice filled with a chilling intensity. "The lodge, it doesn't let go. People come, but they don't always leave. I tried to warn you." Fear surged through her. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. Arthur's eyes bore into hers, filled with a sadness that went beyond words. "I used to work here a long time ago," he said, his voice barely audible. I was, like you, a guest who came and stayed too long. The lodge has a life of its own, and it takes people, keeps them." He raised a hand, gesturing down the corridor, where shadows seemed to writhe and twist in the dim light. "If you don't leave soon, you'll be like me, stuck here, forever a part of this place." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. She closed the door, her hands shaking. She woke Mark, telling him they needed to leave, but he dismissed her fear, saying she was just tired. Desperate, Caroline tried to convince him, but he was adamant, unwilling to leave in the middle of the night. Exhausted, she lay back down, her mind racing, but sleep didn't come. All night she heard footsteps echoing in the halls, soft voices whispering just beyond the walls, as though dozens of people were moving through the lodge in the dead of night. Each time she closed her eyes, she would see Arthur's face, his hollow eyes and solemn warning echoing in her mind. When dawn finally broke, she wasted no time. She packed their bags, insisting they leave at first light. Mark, seeing her distress, reluctantly agreed, and they made their way to the lobby. As they approached the front desk, she saw the young woman from the dining room, standing with her luggage, her face pale and drawn. She too had decided to leave, her expression mirroring Caroline's fear. As they stepped out of the lodge and onto the driveway, Caroline glanced back one last time. There, standing in one of the upper windows, was Arthur, his face pressed against the glass, watching her with those dark, sorrowful eyes. She shivered, feeling as though she were leaving a piece of herself behind, like a fragment of her soul had been claimed by the lodge. They drove away in silence, the looming presence of Blackwood Lodge shrinking in the rearview mirror. But even as they left, Caroline couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur was still with them, watching, waiting, and sometimes late at night she could almost hear his voice, faint and distant, calling her back, as though the lodge still held a piece of her, a connection that could never truly be severed. Months later, she read a news article about Blackwood Lodge. Another couple had gone missing there, vanishing without a trace, their room left untouched, their belongings still in place. And each time she saw a shadow flicker in her home, each time she heard a soft knock in the dead of night, she would remember the caretaker's warning and the cold, empty eyes that had stared back at her from the darkness of Blackwood Lodge. The midnight knock. The first time Caroline heard the knock, she thought it was a dream. It was a soft, persistent tapping, echoing through the silence of her small house. And as she sat up, groggy and confused, she glanced at her phone. The screen glowed with an eerie light, 3 a.m. on the dot. She waited, listening for the sound again, but the house remained silent. She eventually chalked it up to an overactive imagination, dismissed the unease that pricked at her, and lay back down, drifting into an uneasy sleep. The next night, however, the knock returned. It was louder this time and sharper, resonating through the walls. Startled awake, Caroline sat up, her heart pounding. She checked her phone. 3 a.m. She hesitated, glancing toward her bedroom door, debating whether to get up and check. Maybe it was a prank, she thought, or a neighbor knocking by mistake. Finally, summoning her courage, she tiptoed to the front door. Peering through the peephole, she found nothing. No one standing on the porch, no movement in the street. Only the soft glow of the street lamp illuminated the empty sidewalk. As the days passed, the knocking continued, always at 3 a.m., always unanswered. It became a maddening routine, interrupting her sleep, leaving her jumpy and exhausted. She tried everything, sleeping with the TV on, leaving a light on in the hallway, even setting up a camera outside her door. But each morning, when she checked the footage, there was nothing, just an empty porch and the quiet street beyond. The knocking would vanish as mysteriously as it had come. Then, one night, it changed. Caroline lay awake, staring at the ceiling, dreading the inevitable sound. When the knock came, it was softer, almost tentative. But this time it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from inside her house, tapping steadily against her bedroom door. Her breath hitched, her entire body frozen with fear. She tried to tell herself it was her imagination, a trick of the mind, but the sound persisted. A slow, deliberate knock that seemed to echo within her chest. Gathering every ounce of courage, she whispered, "Who's there?" Her voice came out thin, barely audible, but the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing down on her like a weight. She strained her ears, desperate to catch any hint of movement, but the house was still, filled with a silence so complete it felt unnatural. She lay there, heart pounding, until morning light crept through the blinds, dispelling the fear that had gripped her. But the relief was short-lived. Over the next few days, strange things began to happen. Her keys would vanish from their usual spot, only to turn up hours later in random places, once in the refrigerator, another time neatly placed on her bed. She would hear soft footsteps echoing through the hallway at odd hours, just beyond her line of sight. Lights flickered unpredictably, and sometimes she'd find the front door unlocked, even though she was certain she'd locked it. One evening, desperate for an answer, Caroline called her best friend, Mia, who arrived later that night, armed with coffee and a sympathetic ear. She listened patiently as Caroline described the knocks, the strange disturbances, the feeling that something was watching her. Mia frowned, visibly concerned, and suggested they both stay up and wait to confront whoever or whatever was knocking. That night, they stayed in the living room, lights on, sipping coffee and talking to distract themselves. The hours crept by, and just as the clock struck 3 o'clock, the knock came. 3 soft, deliberate taps at the front door. Mia glanced at Caroline, her face pale, but without a word she got up and approached the door. "Hello?" she called, her voice strong despite the tension in her shoulders. No answer. She opened the door, peering outside into the empty street, but there was nothing, just the quiet night and the faint hum of the streetlight. They locked the door again, unease settling heavily between them. But as they turned back toward the living room, a new knock echoed through the house, louder, more insistent. This time it was coming from the hallway, from the door to the basement. Mia swallowed hard, glancing at Caroline. "Do you ever go down there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Caroline shook her head, her face pale. The basement was empty, just a storage space for old boxes and unused furniture. But the knocking persisted, slow and rhythmic, as though something was trapped on the other side, waiting to be let out. With trembling hands, Caroline grabbed a flashlight, and together they made their way down the narrow staircase, the light flickering against the cold cement walls. The basement was colder than usual, the air thick and stale. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, coming from the far corner of the room. Mia's grip tightened on Caroline's arm as they reached the source of the sound, a small, old cabinet, dusty and covered in cobwebs. The knocking stopped the moment they approached. Silence filled the room, and a sickening dread washed over them. Caroline reached out, her hand shaking as she touched the cabinet's handle, slowly pulling it open. Inside, there was nothing but darkness and the faint scent of mildew. She let out a shaky breath, relief mingling with confusion. But just as she was about to close it, Mia's gasp drew her attention. On the inside of the cabinet door, someone had scratched a message into the wood, crude letters gouged deep into the surface. "Let me in." The words sent a chill down Caroline's spine, her heart pounding in her chest. They slammed the cabinet shut, rushing back up the stairs, locking the basement door behind them. That night, neither of them slept, too afraid of what might happen if they closed their eyes. By morning, Mia insisted Caroline stay with her until they could figure out what to do. But even away from the house, the knocking continued. It followed her to Mia's apartment, a soft tapping on the window, on the walls, on the doors. Each time the knocks grew louder, more insistent, as though whatever it was couldn't stand being ignored. Mia's neighbors even began to complain, asking why someone kept knocking on their walls at night. They couldn't explain it, couldn't understand why no one else seemed able to hear it. One night, Caroline woke at exactly 3 a.m. to find Mia standing by the door, her eyes glazed over, her face expressionless. "Caroline," she said, her voice low and strange. "It's cold outside. Please let me in." She repeated the words over and over, her voice hollow, lifeless, as though something else were speaking through her. Terrified, Caroline shook her friend, calling her name, and after a moment, Mia blinked, snapping out of the trance. She looked around, confused, disoriented. Caroline didn't tell her what had happened, but from then on the knocking grew more aggressive, each night louder and closer, as though the force behind it was running out of patience. In desperation, Caroline returned to her house, determined to confront whatever it was. At exactly 3 a.m., she sat by the front door, waiting. When the knock came, she took a deep breath and opened the door. There on her doorstep stood a figure cloaked in shadows, its face obscured. Only its eyes were visible, dark, hollow pits that seemed to swallow the light. The figure raised its hand, pointing at her, and she felt an icy cold seep into her bones, freezing her in place. "You opened the door," it whispered, its voice barely more than a breath. "You let me in." And then everything went black. When she woke, it was morning, the sun shining through the windows, her house silent. But something felt wrong, a gnawing emptiness in her chest, as if something vital had been taken. Her memories of the night were fragmented, like a dream slipping away upon waking. But as she looked around her house, she noticed things were subtly different. Her reflection in the mirror seemed hollow, her eyes duller, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. From that night on, the knock stopped. The house was quiet, almost peaceful, but Caroline knew better. She could feel a presence, lurking just beyond the edge of her vision, following her every move, watching with silent, unblinking eyes. And each night at 3 a.m. she would wake, feeling a cold, invisible hand resting on her shoulder, reminding her that once the door is opened, it can never truly be closed. The Black-Eyed Stranger. It was a cold, rain-soaked evening when Claire first heard the legend of the Black-Eyed Strangers. She was sitting with friends in a small, dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where whispered tales took on a life of their own. One of her friends, a local named Jamie, leaned in close, his voice hushed and serious. "They say there's something out there, strangers who look like anyone else at first glance. But if you look close, you'll notice their eyes. Solid black, no whites, no color, just pitch black. They're not human, or at least not anymore." Claire shivered, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the damp weather outside. "What do they do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jamie glanced around as if afraid they were being watched. "They say that if you look into their eyes too long, they steal something from you. Not your wallet or anything you can see. They take a piece of you. Some people say it's your memories, others think it's your soul. But everyone agrees on one thing: after you meet them, you're never quite the same." They laughed it off after a while, dismissing it as a local ghost story meant to scare newcomers. But that night, as Claire walked home alone, her mind kept returning to the tale. The streets were empty, and the rain had turned to mist, swirling around her feet. Every shadow seemed to twist and move, every distant sound echoing ominously through the narrow streets. She felt watched, a prickling sensation crawling up her spine. The first encounter happened 2 nights later. Claire was coming home late from work, cutting through the park to save time. The fog had rolled in thick, and she could barely see a few feet in front of her. Halfway across, she noticed a figure standing under the streetlight ahead. A man, tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat. He was facing away from her, head slightly tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. She slowed, an inexplicable unease creeping over her. There was something off about him, something that made her instinctively want to turn back. But curiosity won out, and she kept walking, her footsteps muffled by the mist. As she passed, the man turned slowly to face her, and her heart stopped. His eyes, empty black voids, glossy and deep like twin pools of ink, stared directly into hers. No pupils, no whites, just endless, featureless black. Claire froze, unable to look away. The stranger's face was blank, expressionless. His mouth twisted into a faint, unnatural smile that seemed wrong, as if he were wearing someone else's skin. Her thoughts felt slow, her body heavy, as though something were pulling her in. She could feel an invisible force wrapping around her, sapping her energy, her memories slipping like sand through her fingers. Flashes of her childhood, her family, moments she cherished, all began to blur and fade. Somehow, she broke the trance, stumbling backward and gasping for breath. The stranger remained still, watching her with that eerie, unblinking gaze, his mouth curling slightly, as though amused by her struggle. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, he turned and walked into the mist, his form swallowed by the fog. Claire hurried home, locking every door and window behind her, her hands trembling. She tried to convince herself it had been a hallucination, maybe brought on by the fog or the eerie story Jamie had told. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the case. That night, her dreams were filled with darkness, her memories splintered and slipping away. She woke up feeling hollow, as though something had been taken from her, something vital she couldn't quite remember. In the days that followed, Claire became obsessed with finding out more about the black-eyed strangers. She asked around, digging up every scrap of information she could find. Most people laughed it off, but a few, those with haunted eyes and hesitant words, confirmed her fears. They had seen them too, and like her, they felt changed. One man she spoke to, a quiet, reserved older gentleman, told her about his encounter. "They're not human," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "They're like shadows, taking pieces of us. Sometimes I can't even remember my own wife's face anymore." The more she learned, the more terrified she became. Claire tried to avoid going out at night, but the visions haunted her dreams. Shadows with black eyes followed her in her sleep, their whispers wrapping around her mind, eroding her memories and sapping her will. She felt herself slipping, like she was losing pieces of herself, fragments of who she was, fading with each passing day. One night, exhausted and desperate, Claire found herself wandering back to the park. The fog was thick again, curling around the trees, cloaking the world in silence. She didn't know why she'd come, only that some part of her felt drawn, as if answering an unspoken call. And then there they were, 3 figures standing in the mist, each one facing her, each with those hollow black eyes that seemed to pierce her very soul. She tried to run, but her legs felt leaden, her body moving sluggishly as though trapped in a nightmare. One of them stepped closer, a woman this time, her face pale and lifeless, her mouth moving in a slow, cruel smile. "Claire." The voice was soft, almost tender, but filled with malice. It was her own voice, twisted and distorted, echoing back at her. The woman's hand reached out, fingers long and cold, and touched Claire's face. An icy sensation spread through her, numbing her, freezing her thoughts. Memories flashed before her eyes, each one slipping away, dissolving into the blackness of the stranger's eyes. Her childhood home, the sound of her mother's laughter, her first love, each memory stolen, leaving her mind empty and hollow. When she came to, the strangers were gone, and the fog had lifted, revealing the cold, empty park bathed in the first light of dawn. Claire staggered home, feeling as though she were missing pieces of herself, fragments torn away, leaving only emptiness. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, noticing the dullness in her eyes, a hollowness that hadn't been there before. Days turned into weeks, and though Claire tried to resume her normal life, she found herself unable to recall the simplest things. Names, faces, even entire moments of her life felt like faded echoes, slipping further away each time she tried to grasp them. She was haunted by the sensation of eyes watching her, always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance to drain what little remained of her. One evening, as she sat alone in her apartment, she felt a chill pass through the room, the air growing dense and cold. In the dim light, she saw a figure standing in the corner, shrouded in shadow, its black eyes gleaming. It smiled, a slow, mocking grin that promised there was more yet to take. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. They had come back for the rest. The last thing she remembered was the darkness closing in, those empty, soulless eyes staring into hers, pulling her into the void. And when the sun rose the next morning, her apartment was empty, silent, with no sign of Claire ever having been there. Months passed, and her friends searched for her, asking questions, retracing her steps. But those who knew the stories understood. They spoke in hushed tones, knowing what had happened. They said that somewhere out there, Claire was still wandering, just another shadow in the mist, her eyes now as black as the strangers she'd once feared, waiting to call the next soul into the darkness. The night was cold and quiet as 4 friends, Tom, Sarah, Jake, and Lucy, sat around the flickering campfire in the heart of Blackwood Forest. They'd come to escape the bustle of city life, eager for a weekend filled with laughter, campfire stories, and the simple joys of nature. They chose the most secluded spot, miles from the nearest road, surrounded by towering trees that swayed softly in the night breeze. The air was thick with the earthy scent of leaves and damp moss, and the only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustle of the underbrush. They spent hours trading stories and marshmallows, laughing as they recounted old memories. But as midnight approached, a strange hush fell over the forest. The usual sounds of insects and night birds went silent, leaving an eerie stillness that blanketed the woods. Jake was the first to notice it, looking up with a frown. "Anyone else hear that?" he asked, his voice low. The others fell silent, straining to listen, but there was nothing but the whispering wind. Then, from somewhere deep within the forest, a voice drifted toward them. Soft and faint at first, it seemed to be calling their names, each syllable stretching out, echoed and warped by the trees. "Tom, Sarah, Jake, Lucy." The voice was oddly familiar, yet distant, as if someone they knew was just out of sight, hidden behind the wall of trees. Lucy shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Did one of you wander off earlier? Maybe someone's lost," she suggested, trying to make sense of the strange occurrence. But each of them shook their heads, their faces etched with confusion and an unspoken fear. Tom, always the bravest of the group, stood up, his flashlight in hand. "Stay here, I'll check it out," he said, his voice firm despite the tension in his eyes. As Tom ventured into the darkness, the others exchanged uneasy glances. The voice continued, growing slightly louder, weaving through the trees and curling around them like smoke. It was calm and gentle, yet somehow unsettling, carrying an unnatural echo. Tom hadn't gone far when he stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight illuminating nothing but the dark trunks of trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of eyes lurking in the shadows, waiting. The voice called again, clearer this time, as though it were right beside him. "Tom." It was a perfect mimicry of Sarah's voice, soft and warm, the way she would say his name when she was tired. A shiver ran down his spine. He turned around, expecting to see her standing there, but there was no one. Only the empty, endless darkness and the quiet rustle of leaves underfoot. Meanwhile, back at the campsite, Sarah grew anxious. "He's been gone too long," she muttered, glancing toward the path Tom had taken. What if something happened to him? Jake nodded, grabbing his own flashlight. "I'll go after him. Stay here, Lucy," he said, his voice wavering slightly. Reluctantly, he left the circle of light, plunging into the darkness as the fire's glow faded behind him. Jake walked in silence, calling out Tom's name, but no answer came. Instead, the voice came again, closer, whispering his name with a twisted familiarity. "Yaka." It was Tom's voice this time, filled with a sense of urgency. Yet something was off, an unnatural tone beneath the familiar sound, as if someone were trying to imitate Tom, but not quite getting it right. Jake's heart pounded, but he kept walking, hoping to catch up to his friend. Suddenly, he saw a faint figure in the distance, illuminated by the thin beam of his flashlight. Relief washed over him as he recognized Tom's shape, standing still in the shadows. "Tom, what are you doing out here? We need to get back," Jake called. But Tom didn't move. He just stood there, motionless, staring into the darkness. Jake approached, his steps slowing as he noticed something odd about Tom's stance. His head was tilted at an unnatural angle, his arms hanging limply by his sides. Then, slowly, Tom turned to face him, his eyes wide and vacant, a twisted smile stretching across his face. "Yaak," he said, his voice flat, almost robotic, as though he were reading lines from a script. Fear rooted Jake to the spot. The thing in front of him looked like Tom, but its eyes held none of the warmth or humor he knew. It was as if something was wearing Tom's skin, mimicking him, but with an empty, soulless gaze. He took a step back, his voice trembling. You're not Tom." The creature tilted its head, the twisted smile widening. "Jaaka," it repeated, taking a slow, shuffling step toward him. In a surge of panic, Jake turned and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he tore through the forest, branches scraping against him, the eerie echo of his name following him like a shadow. Back at the campsite, Sarah and Lucy huddled by the fire, their nerves fraying as they waited. The voice returned, calling their names in a sing-song tone, weaving around the trees. "Sarah, Lucy." It was gentle, almost coaxing, yet filled with a sinister undercurrent. Lucy grabbed Sarah's arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to leave, Sarah. This place isn't safe." But before they could move, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was Jake, or at least it looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking, his mouth stretched into that same unnatural grin. "Sarah, Lucy," he said, his voice hollow, his gaze fixed on them with a predatory intensity. They froze, their minds racing, torn between disbelief and terror. Just as they were about to scream, another figure appeared beside him, Tom, moving with the same unnatural gait, his face mirroring Jake's empty smile. The two figures stepped closer, their movements eerily synchronized, their voices merging in a haunting chorus. Come with us, deeper into the woods." Panic seized Sarah, and she grabbed Lucy's hand, pulling her away from the fire. They ran blindly, their feet pounding against the forest floor, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The voices followed them, echoing through the trees, calling their names in that twisted, mocking tone. Every time they glanced back, they could see glimpses of their friends, Tom and Jake, or whatever wore their faces, stalking them through the trees, their eyes gleaming in the dark. Finally, they stumbled upon a narrow path that led out of the woods. The voices faded, and the oppressive weight lifted from the air. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, barely able to breathe as they slammed the doors and sped down the dark road, leaving the forest and its horrors behind. Days later, the police combed the woods, searching for Tom and Jake, but there was no trace of them. The campsite was found abandoned, their belongings scattered, and no footprints led out of the forest. Sarah and Lucy knew the truth, though they would never speak of it. They knew their friends were still out there, lost in the endless darkness, trapped in the twisted, unholy embrace of whatever haunted those woods. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when sleep eluded them, they would hear it again. The soft, familiar voices of Tom and Jake, calling their names, urging them to return to the woods, to join them in the shadows where the light would never reach. They called it the Devil's Stretch, a lonely, winding road cutting through miles of dense forest, known for its strange happenings and ominous tales. For as long as anyone could remember, stories circulated about the stretch of highway between mile markers 17 and 23, where drivers reported ghostly figures appearing in the headlights, whispers filling the air, and a bone-chilling sense of dread that would linger long after they'd left. Locals avoided it, especially around midnight, but to outsiders, it was just another rural road. And for Alex and his friends, it was an irresistible dare. One chilly November evening, Alex and his three friends, Emma, Mark, and Rachel, piled into his old car, laughing and full of bravado. They'd heard the rumors, but they were skeptical. After all, they'd grown up in a world of urban legends and ghost stories, and each time, the so-called haunted places had been nothing but hype. But the haunted highway was different. Even as they drove toward it, the air in the car grew heavier, tinged with an unspoken apprehension that no one dared acknowledge. The first few miles were uneventful. The road was dark, flanked by towering trees that seemed to close in on them, branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. They passed mile marker 16, and Alex cracked a joke, trying to lighten the mood. But as they approached mile marker 17, an eerie silence fell over the group. The hum of the engine seemed louder, and the darkness outside grew deeper, more oppressive. It felt like they had crossed an invisible boundary, entering a place where the rules of the world no longer applied. At mile marker 18, Emma leaned forward, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. "Do you see that?" she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. Alex squinted, his hands tightening on the wheel. Up ahead there was a figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible in the shadows. As they drew closer, they could make out more details. A woman, dressed in tattered clothes, her hair hanging down in tangled clumps, covering her face. She stood motionless, her head tilted slightly as if listening to something only she could hear. "Should we stop?" Rachel asked, her voice filled with hesitation. But before anyone could answer, the woman turned her head, looking directly at them. Her eyes were empty, hollow pits, and her mouth twisted into a grin that was anything but friendly. In a panic, Alex floored the accelerator, the car lurching forward as they sped past her. But even as they drove away, the feeling of her gaze lingered, a chill that crept up their spines and settled in their bones. They drove in silence for a few moments, each of them lost in their thoughts, until Mark broke the silence. "Did anyone else see her, smiling?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one answered, but the tension in the car grew, each of them feeling an unspoken dread. They had all seen it, the strange, unnatural grin, and the hollow emptiness in her eyes that seemed to devour the light. As they approached mile marker 20, the air inside the car grew colder, their breaths visible in the dim light of the dashboard. A thick fog began to roll in, blanketing the road and reducing their visibility to almost nothing. The headlights barely pierced the dense mist, illuminating only a few feet ahead. Alex slowed down, his heart pounding, his mind racing with unease. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before them, an unyielding path into the unknown. Then, out of nowhere, a loud thud echoed through the car, as if something had struck it from above. They all jumped, their eyes darting around, but there was nothing to be seen. Just as they began to calm down, another bang came from the roof, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound that sent shivers down their spines. It was as if something, or someone, was crawling across the roof, claws raking against the metal. Alex gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, his mind racing with panic. Emma, sitting in the front seat, slowly turned her head to look out the passenger window, her eyes widening in horror. It's on the roof," she whispered, barely able to get the words out. A shadowy figure, barely visible through the fogged window, was crouched on top of the car, its fingers splayed across the glass. It was watching them, its face pressed close to the window, eyes black and soulless, staring directly at Emma. She gasped, turning away, her whole body trembling. Without thinking, Alex swerved the car, hoping to shake whatever it was off the roof. The creature slid, but its fingers clung to the edge, a low, unnatural growl reverberating through the car. They could hear it, a sinister whispering, a language none of them understood, filling the silence like an insidious melody. It was a voice that seemed to come from within their minds, urging them to do things they didn't want to think about. Finally, with a jolt, whatever was on the roof disappeared, leaving them shaken and breathless. But the sense of relief was short-lived. As they approached mile marker 22, they noticed the road seemed different, almost as if it were leading them in circles. The fog thickened, swirling around them, and the temperature dropped further. Then, out of the mist, they saw figures, shadowy silhouettes lining the road, watching them, standing still and silent. Their faces were indistinct, blurred, but their eyes seemed to glow with a faint, unholy light. One by one, the figures stepped onto the road, forcing Alex to stop the car. They were trapped, surrounded on all sides, the eerie figures closing in, inch by inch. Alex gripped the wheel, his mind racing as he searched for a way out. What do they want?" Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. But no one could answer. The figures moved closer, their whispers filling the car, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. Each whisper was a fragment of a story, snippets of lost souls, travelers who had ventured onto this road and never returned, their fates sealed by the horrors that lurked in the shadows. They could feel the despair, the fear, the overwhelming sense of dread that these souls had experienced in their final moments. Desperate, Alex slammed his foot on the accelerator, driving straight through the figures, expecting resistance but feeling nothing as they passed. The fog lifted suddenly, the road ahead clear, mile marker 23 looming in the distance. He didn't stop, didn't slow down until they were miles away, back on familiar roads, the darkness and fog a distant memory. They didn't speak the rest of the way home. When they finally reached town, each of them looked at one another, unspoken horror mirrored in their eyes. They knew that what they had seen would never truly leave them, that the memories of that cursed road would haunt them forever. And each night, as they tried to sleep, they would hear the whispers, faint but persistent, calling them back to the haunted highway, reminding them that some roads are never truly left behind. The autumn leaves had just started to turn, a burnt orange and gold palette painting the quiet suburban neighborhood, when Laura first noticed her neighbor's absence. Mr. Harper had been her neighbor for almost 5 years, a man of peculiar habits and unwavering routines. She'd grown accustomed to his evening rituals, watching him from her kitchen window as he watered his garden each night at precisely 7, humming old tunes under his breath. He was solitary but pleasant enough, exchanging polite waves and the occasional chat over the garden fence. But one night, there was no sign of Mr. Harper. His small calico cat, Jasper, wandered the garden alone, letting out mournful, distressed meows. Laura dismissed it initially, assuming Mr. Harper had gone out for an evening stroll. Yet as the days passed and Jasper continued his lonely vigil, it became evident that something was wrong. On the 5th day, Laura called the police. A missing persons investigation was launched, and officers combed through Mr. Harper's house and the neighborhood, asking questions but finding little of interest. There were no signs of a struggle, and no one had seen him leave. It was as if he had simply disappeared into thin air. But Laura couldn't shake a feeling of unease that lingered after the officers had left, a nagging sense that something strange and sinister was at play. A week later, Laura's curiosity overwhelmed her caution. She had lived in this neighborhood her whole life and had never known anyone to disappear so mysteriously. She decided to visit Mr. Harper's house herself, hoping to find something the police might have overlooked. Standing before his house, she was struck by how abandoned it already looked. The curtains were drawn tight, the paint peeling in spots, and the once tidy garden was beginning to look unkempt. The front door, to her surprise, was unlocked, creaking open as she pushed it, as though the house itself were beckoning her inside. The air inside felt thick, stale, and cold, almost as if the house had been abandoned for years. A faint smell of dust and something metallic hung in the air. Mr. Harper's living room was exactly as she remembered it from the one time she had been inside. A cozy room filled with old books, leather armchairs, and sepia-toned family photos. Yet something was wrong. A layer of dust covered everything. A strange occurrence given he had vanished only days ago. Laura shivered as her eyes landed on a half-finished cup of tea on the table, a smear of a handprint on its side. A chill ran through her as she noticed a single set of footprints in the dust, leading from the kitchen to the basement door. Her curiosity growing, Laura followed the footprints, each step adding weight to her chest, a sensation of something heavy and unseen pressing down upon her. The basement door was slightly ajar, revealing only darkness below. She paused, hesitating, then flicked on the light switch. The single bulb in the basement cast a dim, flickering glow over the concrete steps, revealing shelves lined with dusty jars and peculiar objects she had never seen before, small statues, strange crystals, and books bound in dark, cracked leather. At the center of the basement lay a large, weathered tome, open as if it had been recently read. Laura approached it cautiously, her eyes scanning the pages filled with strange symbols and drawings of otherworldly creatures. She noticed a note in Mr. Harper's handwriting, scrawled hastily on the side of the page. "It's here. Do not open the door." A cold sweat broke out on Laura's forehead. The words sent a shiver down her spine, and she felt the prickling sensation of being watched. She turned to leave, but as she took a step back, the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging her into darkness. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest, straining to listen in the oppressive silence. Then she heard it, a soft, raspy whisper, echoing through the basement. It sounded like Mr. Harper's voice, yet there was something wrong, a strange, inhuman tone layered within it. "Laura," the voice murmured, stretching her name like a twisted lullaby. "You shouldn't have come here." Her breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, and there, in the dim light, she saw a figure emerging from the shadows at the edge of the room. It was Mr. Harper, or something that looked like him. His skin was pale, stretched taut over his bones, and his eyes were dark voids, empty and hollow. A twisted smile was etched across his face, a grotesque imitation of warmth. He moved toward her slowly, gliding rather than walking, his feet barely touching the ground. Panicked, Laura scrambled backward, pressing herself against the cold, damp wall. You're not real," she whispered. her voice trembling. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if considering her words, then leaned forward, its face inches from hers. "Real?" it whispered, a mocking edge in its tone. "I am as real as the darkness that surrounds you, as real as the fear that lives within you." Without thinking, Laura turned and ran up the stairs, banging on the door, screaming for help. But her cries were swallowed by the silence of the house. The air grew colder, thick with an unnatural chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She heard the soft padding of footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate, echoing her own frantic steps. Turning around, she saw Mr. Harper's figure standing at the bottom of the stairs, watching her, a smile spreading across his face. In a final, desperate attempt, she threw her weight against the door, and to her astonishment, it flew open. She stumbled out, slamming it behind her, locking it tight. She didn't stop running until she was back in her own house, her hands shaking as she fumbled to lock her own door. She peered through her window, her gaze fixed on Mr. Harper's house, where a faint light flickered in the basement window. She thought she saw a shadow pass by, but when she blinked, it was gone. From that night on, Laura kept her distance from Mr. Harper's house. It stood there, silent and looming, a dark shadow on the street. Neighbors whispered about strange sounds that came from the house at night. Soft whispers, faint footsteps, the occasional flash of light from the basement window. No one dared to go near it, and soon, even Jasper, the calico cat, disappeared, leaving the house truly empty. Years passed, and Mr. Harper's house remained untouched, slowly decaying, as if something within was draining the life out of it. Eventually, the town decided to demolish it, and Laura, unable to resist, returned to watch. As the walls came down, the workers uncovered a hidden room in the basement, filled with strange artifacts, symbols etched into the walls, and at the center, a large mirror with the words, "It's watching," scratched into its surface. As she gazed into the broken glass, she felt an odd sense of déjà vu, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a dark shadow flickering behind her own reflection. Even now, years later, Laura sometimes hears a whisper in the dead of night, a faint, familiar voice calling her name, drawing her back to the darkness she barely escaped. And though she locks her doors tight, the feeling never leaves her, that somewhere in the shadows, something is watching, waiting, biding its time until the door is opened once more. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.